The low country of South Carolina in 1847 held its secrets the way the marsh held water, silently, completely, and with a patience that outlasted every human attempt to drain it dry. The air there smelled of salt and dark river mud and something older than either, something that had no English name but that every person who lived within 20 miles of it recognized in their bones as the smell of a place that remembered everything that had ever happened inside it. Live oaks draped in Spanish moss lined the approach to Greyfield plantation like witnesses who had learned long ago that the safest position was one of apparent indifference. They had seen enough. They intended to keep seeing. They intended to say nothing. Harlan Voss was 43 that year, a second-generation planter who had expanded his father's 400 acres to nearly twice that size through a combination of patience, capital, and the particular appetite for land that the low country seemed to produce in certain men the way its soil produced. Sea Island cotton, abundantly and with very little visible effort. He was not cruel in the ways that history tends to record cruelty. He did not drink himself into rages. He did not make spectacles of his authority. He was, by the careful standards of his time and place, considered a reasonable man, a practical man, and it was his practicality more than any other quality that would eventually lead him to do something that no one in St. Helena Parish had ever seen done before, and that no one, once they had seen it, could find adequate language to describe. He had a wife named Margaret who expressed strong feeling only in private, if at all. He had a son named Thomas, 17, already being prepared to inherit the machinery of Greyfield, who watched the world with his mother's contained quality and his father's appetite for understanding how things worked. He had a daughter named Clara, 14, who had begun keeping a journal that her mother encouraged as suitable occupation for a girl of her station, and that was becoming something considerably more than that. And he had, among the 100 or so enslaved people who worked the fields and the house and the various outbuildings of the plantation, one man whose position defied every category that the system had invented to contain him. His name was Kato, just Kato, no surname acknowledged by anyone at Greyfield, though he had one, or had had one once, before the auction house in Charleston in the spring of 1832 had reduced his entire history to a lot number and a bill of sale. He had arrived as a boy of perhaps 12 or 13, purchased from the estate of a deceased planter in Colleton district whose records were incomplete and whose trail went cold at the point of sale. By 1847 he was approximately 27 or 28 years old. Tall, lean, with hands that seemed slightly too large for his body and a face that people remembered without being able to say precisely why. Not handsome in any conventional sense, not striking in any obvious way, but possessed of a quality of stillness that made anyone who looked at him feel that he was seeing considerably more than they had intended to show. He had been head driver at Greyfield for several years, the enslaved man responsible for overseeing the work of the field hands, managing the pace and quality of the cotton harvest, and serving as the primary intermediary between the enslaved community and Denton Frick, the white overseer who had held his position for 6 years and who was by any honest assessment substantially less competent at his job than the man nominally beneath him. This was not unusual. In the Sea Island cotton country, where the crop demanded an almost surgical precision at every stage of cultivation, the head driver was the person who actually understood how everything worked. He was indispensable, and indispensability in the plantation economy was a form of power, limited and conditional and always carefully disguised, but real. Kato had understood this since he was 15 years old. What no one at Greyfield understood yet was the precise nature of what he had been doing with that understanding for the better part of a decade. He had been learning, not in any dramatic sense, not through any formal arrangement, not in ways that anyone had thought to notice or prevent. He had learned the cotton, the soil composition of every field, the optimal timing of every stage of cultivation, the precise relationship between the August sea winds and the quality of the fiber in the bolls. He had learned the ledgers by watching over the shoulder of the overseer who preceded Frick, a careless man named Garland who did not pay attention to the boy sweeping the floor of the cotton house and studying the columns of figures with the focused attention of someone memorizing a map. He had learned to read through years of patient solitary observation that he never mentioned to anyone. He had learned the shape of Harlan Voss's debts, piecing them together from fragments, from overheard conversations, from documents that passed through the cotton house in the ordinary course of business, from ledger entries glimpsed through open doors. By 1847 he possessed a more complete and accurate picture of Greyfield's financial situation than Harlan Voss himself could have produced from memory. But none of that was the most important thing Kato knew. The most important thing had come through an open window on a still spring night in 1846, carried on the warm air from the marsh, along with the smell of saltgrass and the distant sound of the tidal creek. Reginald Havestock was a planter from Colleton district who had known Harlan Voss since childhood and disliked him with the steady, practiced intensity of a man who has had decades to refine his grievance. He had come to Greyfield that spring, ostensibly to negotiate access to a tidal creek that both properties used for transporting cotton bales to the river landing, a creek that Voss controlled through his recent purchase of a 200-acre parcel that Havestock had wanted and had been outmaneuvered in acquiring. The negotiation had not gone well. Voss had been polite and immovable, and Havestock had spent 3 days at Greyfield drinking steadily and building toward something. On the second night, after the household had retired, the two men sat in the study with the windows open to catch the marsh breeze. and Haverstock, in the grip of a rage that the whiskey had not moderated but had instead provided with a sharper edge, said what he had come to say. He had in his possession a written account left by his late father, a document that described in specific detail a series of transactions conducted by Edmund Voss, Harlan's father, in the years before his death. Transactions involving the falsification of legal documents related to the ownership and transfer of enslaved people, conducted to conceal a substantial debt owed to a man in Virginia and settled through means that were under South Carolina law fraudulent. If this information were brought before the county court, the consequences for Harlan Voss, who had inherited both the plantation and arguably the liability for his father's crimes, would be severe. The land could be seized, the debts called in, Greyfield, in the worst case, lost entirely. Voss had listened in silence and said he would think about it. Haverstock had left the next morning, cold-faced, and the threat had settled into the plantation like weather. Kato had been awake in the cotton house, working late on the season's accounts by lamplight as he often was. The cotton house stood close enough to the main house that sound carried on still nights through open windows. He heard everything Haverstock said. He heard Voss's silence. He heard the precise nature of the threat and the specific character of the evidence that supported it, and he filed it away with the same careful precision with which he filed away everything else he learned. And he waited, because patience in the world Kato inhabited was not a virtue. It was the only form of power available to a person in his position. The power of knowing when not to act, the power of holding something in reserve until the moment when it would matter most. He spent the following year gathering what the open window had not provided. He found the original falsified documents in a hiding place that Edmund Voss had used in the cotton house, a place his son had apparently never discovered, and he noted their location and left them undisturbed. He found evidence of a separate transaction conducted by Haverstock himself, a sale of an enslaved person recorded as voluntary but conducted in violation of a specific provision of South Carolina law enacted in 1820. Evidence buried in the fragments and ledger entries and overheard conversations that he had been collecting for years without knowing when any particular piece would become useful. He assembled the complete picture with the methodical thoroughness of a man building something that has to hold weight. In the autumn of 1847, the cotton harvest came in extraordinary. The numbers were better than they had been in 5 years. Harlan Voss was wealthy that season in the expansive, generous mood that prosperity produced in practical men, and in this mood he did something that no one at Greyfield had ever seen him do. He invited Kato to dine with him. At the main table, with the family silver laid out and the candles lit, Kato appeared at the dining room at precisely the hour supper was served, wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, his hands scrubbed to the wrist, and he sat at the table and ate and spoke when spoken to and remained silent when he was not. And what he said, by the account of the one household servant who later described the evening, was measured and precise and entirely without the performative deference that characterized most interactions between enslaved people and their enslavers. He did not look at the floor. He answered Harlan Voss's questions about the harvest with the same directness he would have used with the overseer, and when Voss asked him about the soil composition of the eastern fields, a question Denton Frick could not have answered, Kato answered it in a way that made Voss sit back in his chair and look at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. The next evening Kato was at the table again. No one had invited him a second time. He simply appeared at the same hour, in the same chair, and Harlan Voss, after a moment's pause, nodded, as if this were expected, as if it had been agreed upon. And so it continued night after night through the autumn and into the winter. The silence around the arrangement was from the very beginning absolute. The household staff served him without comment. Denton Frick said nothing, which was the most telling silence of all, because Frick was not a man naturally inclined toward silence. He had looked at the situation and made a calculation, and the calculation had told him to keep his mouth shut. The neighbors heard within weeks, as the Low Country's network of information ensured they would. The ministers heard. The county sheriff heard. Not one of them said a word to Harlan Voss. In a society built on the absolute enforcement of racial hierarchy, in a place where a black man sitting at a white man's table was not merely a social transgression but a challenge to the entire architecture of the world as it existed, the silence of the community was not comfortable. It was the silence of people who had decided that whatever was happening at Greyfield was something they did not want to look at too directly. Clara, watching from across the table with her mother's focused attention turned outward rather than inward, wrote in her journal that winter, "He watches everything. I do not think Father understands how much he watches. He sat at supper tonight and answered Father's question about the eastern fields, and I thought, he knows more about this plantation than Father does. He knows more about everything here than any of us, and I do not know what he intends to do with that knowledge, but I am certain he intends something." She was right, but not in the way she imagined. What Kato intended was not power over Greyfield. It was not revenge against the people who had held power over him. It was something more specific and in its own way more audacious. He intended to make himself so essential to the functioning of the plantation and to the personal security of its owner that the ordinary mechanisms of the system would be unable to touch him. He intended to construct through years of careful work a position so singular and so necessary that the question of his status, enslaved or free, property or person, would become in practical terms irrelevant. And in the autumn of 1847 he had gone to Harlan Voss, not with threats, not with demands, but with information. Precise, carefully organized information about the state of Voss's legal exposure and about what could be done to address it. The proposal was not complicated. In exchange for certain arrangements that included but were not limited to a seat at the dinner table, Kato would help Voss navigate the threat that Havestock represented. He would help neutralize it using the information and the documents that only Kato knew existed and only Kato could access. Voss had listened to all of it and then laughed, a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it, and said, "You've been planning this for a long time." "Yes, sir," Kato said. "How long?" "Since I was about 15. Voss had looked at him for a long moment. "All right," he said, "just that. All right." In March of 1848, Havestock returned to Greyfield uninvited, riding up the Live Oak Avenue with a lawyer named Taft and the air of a man who had decided that patience was finished. He laid out his threat in the parlor with professional efficiency. Voss listened, sipped his bourbon, and then said quietly that he would like Havestock to meet someone, and called for Kato, who came in from the study where he had apparently been waiting, carrying a leather folder, and sat down across from Havestock with the unhurried composure that characterized everything he did. What followed took 40 minutes. Kato laid out document by document the complete picture of Edmund Voss's fraudulent transactions, not Havestock's version based on his father's second-hand account, but the original falsified records themselves, held for years in the Cotton House hiding place. Presented now with the calm precision of a man who had been preparing this presentation since before anyone else in the room knew the presentation was coming. And then he laid out the documentation of Havestock's own violation of the 1820 statute, assembled from years of fragments, specific and detailed and impossible to dismiss. Taft leaned forward and put on his spectacles. Havestock's face moved through several expressions, none of them comfortable. "Where did you get these?" he said finally. "That's not relevant," Kato said. Havestock turned to Voss. "You're going to let him speak to me like that?" Harlan Voss looked at his bourbon glass. "He's speaking the truth," he said. "It's not relevant." The silence lasted a long time. A mockingbird called somewhere in the live oaks and was silent. Havestock stood, picked up his hat, looked at Kato one final time with the expression of a man trying to categorize something that refused to fit any available category, and walked out without another word. Taft followed him, clutching his satchel. They rode back down the avenue and did not return. The legal proceeding was never filed. Harlan Voss began the process of manumitting Kato quietly through a Charleston lawyer named Cornelius Pringle, without announcement or explanation. The petition worked through the relevant channels for months before anyone at Greyfield knew it existed. Kato knew almost from the beginning, having read Pringle's letter as it passed through the Cotton House before forwarding it to the main house. As he read everything, he said nothing. He continued to appear at the dinner table every evening, to manage the plantation's affairs with the same quiet competence, to be in all visible respects exactly what he had been before. But Clara noticed something shift in him after that period, a quality of attention that had changed, a sense that the waiting which had defined him for so long was entering its final stage. The petition was approved in the spring of 1849. Kato was legally free on a morning in April. He was 29 years old. He had been enslaved for 17 years. He had spent the last decade of those years building with a patience and precision that defied easy description the conditions of his own liberation. He stayed for 6 more months, continuing to manage the plantation's affairs, continuing to appear at the dinner table, now paid in actual wages, recorded in the ledgers and kept in a small tin box in the Cotton House. In October of 1849 he left without announcement, packing what he owned, which was not much, and walking down the avenue of live oaks in the early morning light. Clara watched him from her window. She wrote in her journal that morning he did not look back, not once. "I watched until he was gone from sight, and he never turned. I have been trying to decide what that means, and I think I have decided. It means that he had already said goodbye to this place a long time ago. He was just waiting for his body to catch up." The county courthouse records that might have provided a clearer picture of the legal proceedings were destroyed in a fire in 1879. The fire was officially attributed to a lamp left burning overnight. Several people alive at the time expressed private doubts about this explanation. No investigation was conducted and the matter was closed. Greyfield survived him by 15 years. Harlan Voss died in 1857. Thomas Voss attempted to run the plantation afterward but lacked the knowledge that had for years resided primarily in the man who sat at the dinner table and was now gone. By 1865 it was finished, absorbed into the wreckage of everything the war unmade, somewhere down the avenue of live oaks. In the early morning light of an October day in 1849, a man who had spent 17 years building the conditions of his own freedom walked away from the place that had held him, carrying a small bundle, not looking back, and was gone into the ordinary world, which was all he had ever wanted, and which had cost him everything he had to give.